Policeman throws scorpions at black boy. What the father did later. Nobody believed. Imagine a simple afternoon at the park that turns into an unimaginable nightmare. An innocent boy, a cruel act, and a father willing to do anything for justice. This is the story of courage and unity that challenged corruption and transformed an entire community. Get ready for an exciting journey that will keep you hooked until the last second. And before we start, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel Reflections and Stories, and share this story with those you love. Together, we can spread this message of strength and transformation. Who could have imagined that a simple child's game in the park would turn into a nightmare capable of forever changing the life of a family in São Paulo, Brazil? What's up, guys? Before we start this impressive story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. Comment from which city you are watching because this story will touch your emotions. João Pedro, a boy of just 8 years old, was playing happily in the municipal park of São Paulo in Brazil on a Sunday afternoon. His father, Roberto, a respected university professor, watched his son from a distance as he talked to other parents. What no one knew was that seemingly peaceful afternoon would mark the beginning of a series of events that would reveal the darkest side of human nature. Police officer Marcos Santos, known in the neighborhood for his explosive temper and a history of questionable behavior, was patrolling the area. His eyes fixed on João Pedro in a disturbing way. The boy, innocent in his play, did not realize the danger that was approaching. Roberto began to notice something strange in the police officer's behavior, the way he followed his son with his gaze, like a predator watching its prey. Still, his worst nightmares couldn't predict what was about to happen. The minutes that followed would leave deep scars not only on João Pedro and his family, but also on the community around him. Stay until the end to follow this exciting and reflective story. What is the limit between justice and revenge? The answers to that question would forever change the fate of everyone involved. What happened in that park was just the beginning. The real story is what came next, the choices a father was forced to make, and the consequences no one could have predicted. Is there justice in a world where those who should protect are the same ones who cause pain? How far can a parent go to protect their child? Roberto Silva, 42 years old, was a university professor who kept a small terrarium in his room where he observed and cataloged different species of ants. This hobby, encouraged by his father, symbolized the awakening of a future scientist. On that fateful Sunday, he was at Jabaquara Municipal Park, a space that, more than a place of leisure, was a meeting point for the different social classes in the neighborhood. There, the tensions of social inequality in São Paulo were evident in the looks and gestures of the regulars. Marcos Santos, 38 years old, was a police officer known to the local community. Although he carried the weight of the uniform that symbolizes order, he hid a deep-rooted prejudice, which manifested itself especially against black and poor people. He had a history of complaints about abuse of authority, all of which were mysteriously archived. Maria Conceição, a 65-year-old popcorn seller, was a constant figure in the park. He knew every corner and every story that unfolded there. She had also silently witnessed several of the atrocities committed by Santos. That afternoon, it was she who first noticed something strange: the policeman's behavior, his fixed gaze, and the way he carried something disturbing. The evidence against Marcos Santos was fragile, but not due to a lack of evidence. Maria and other members of the community always came up against the protection that the police officer received from his influential superiors. The choices Roberto made from that moment on and what came after would transform not only his life, but also the future of everyone involved. The line between justice and revenge has never been so thin. Oliveira saw Roberto as the possible key to finally achieving justice, but he had no idea what direction events would take. The Jabaquara neighborhood, with its typical São Paulo contradictions, served as the stage for this plot. On one side, upper-middle-class condominiums where Roberto lived with his son. On the other, poor communities that suffered daily from police violence. On that fateful afternoon while João Pedro was playing near the park's small lake, police officer Marcos Santos sneaked up on him. The boy, who was observing a beetle with childish curiosity, felt the policeman's shadow over him. "What do we have here? A little scientist?" Santos's deep voice carried a tone of mockery that made João Pedro instinctively flinch. Roberto, who was talking to Dr. Ana Beatriz about a research project, noticed the police officer approaching. Something in his paternal instinct triggered an alert. Then, João Pedro's scream cut the air in the park like a razor. Dozens of small yellow scorpions, the most poisonous species in Brazil, fell on the boy. Santos had collected the animals illegally and purposely threw them at João Pedro. "Help, Dad!" The despair in João Pedro's voice mixed with the sound of screams from other park-goers. Roberto ran like never before, but the distance seemed endless. Santos, with a sadistic smile on his face, watched the scene as the boy was repeatedly stung by the scorpions. When he realized the gravity of the situation, he tried to move away, disguising it. It was just a joke. The kid who is weak. The racist comment was the final straw. Roberto, always controlled and rational, felt something break inside him. Holding his son in his arms, he shouted, "You will pay for this! I swear on my son's life that you will pay!" The ambulance arrived in record time, thanks to the influence of Dr. Ana Beatriz. João Pedro was rushed to the hospital showing serious symptoms from the bites. Maria Conceição, who watched everything, declared, "Everyone here knows, this delegate is not a saint. It wasn't the first time he was mean to the children here, but it was the worst. Everything was recorded by witnesses." Roberto knew that the road ahead would be arduous, but at that moment he had only one certainty. He would fight until the end for justice to be done. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the medical team struggled to stabilize João Pedro. The venom from multiple yellow scorpion stings could be fatal, especially to a child. Roberto, torn between the fear of losing his son and his growing anger against Santos, began to formulate a plan in his mind. Dr. Ana Beatriz noticed the change in her friend's eyes. She had known Roberto for years and had never seen him like that. At the same time, she was investigating the allegations against Santos and discovered a disturbing pattern. In the last 5 years, 5 black children had been admitted to the emergency room with unexplained accidents during police patrols in the park. Maria Conceição, who had handed the video over to the authorities, began to receive anonymous threats. Notes were left at her popcorn stand. Phone calls in the middle of the night terrified her, and suspicious figures hung around her house. Despite his fear, his determination to bring justice remained intact. Secretly, she began gathering more evidence against Santos. Meanwhile, Roberto, in his work routine at the university, showed unusual behavior. Colleagues noticed that he requested access to specific substances that were not part of his usual research. His laboratory assistant, Julia, realized that he was developing a new compound, something that was not part of any official project. At the hospital, Nurse Luciana developed a special affection for João Pedro. During night rounds, she discovered that the boy, even when sedated, was murmuring about other children, mentioning strange names and situations. This information aroused suspicion. At the same time, Camila Santos, a young reporter and distant cousin of Marcos Santos, began her own investigation. He discovered that similar cases of violence involving black children had occurred in other parks in the city, always hushed up by the police force. While watching over his son in the hospital, Roberto began to receive mysterious calls. An electronically altered voice offered information about Santos in exchange for his knowledge of toxicology. The temptation to accept the offer grew every day as new evidence of a pattern of violence emerged. However, Roberto did not realize that he was being monitored. Hospital security cameras recorded his comings and goings to the university laboratory at suspicious times. Even though he was away from office, Santos kept his eyes and ears active everywhere. He used his influence to threaten witnesses and eliminate evidence. For him, Roberto represented a threat, but also an opportunity to reassert his authority. "That stuck-up teacher needs to learn what Black's place is on the floor," Santos said to a corrupt colleague. Meanwhile, in the hospital, João Pedro had a sudden and unexpected improvement. During a moment of lucidity, he revealed something to Nurse Luciana that would completely change the course of the investigation. The boy's words, although fragmented, pointed to dark secrets that Santos was desperately trying to hide. João Pedro's story was just the tip of an iceberg of violence and institutional corruption that was beginning to surface. Delegate Oliveira was the first to notice something strange when Dr. Ana Beatriz reported a crucial discovery. Santos had a tattoo identical to that of a man caught in the secret laboratory. This specific symbol was used by members of a criminal organization that operated in the shadows, spread throughout the city. The connection was clear. Santos wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was the link between the police and a scheme that used children as guinea pigs to test new types of poisons. Meanwhile, Roberto, when analyzing the compound found in João Pedro's blood, made a disturbing discovery. The scorpion venom had been modified with a formula he himself had developed years ago but never published. This meant someone had access to your confidential files. Reporter Camila Santos, increasingly involved, took her findings to the Internal Affairs Department and the Public Prosecutor's Office. However, the real turning point occurred when Roberto, reviewing the recordings from his laboratory's security cameras, realized that his assistant Julia was accessing his secret documents at night. When confronted, Julia revealed, through tears, "They have my daughter. Santos said they would only return it if I helped monitor you." That confession changed everything. The case stopped being just a personal revenge and became a mission to dismantle an entire criminal network. It wasn't just about saving João Pedro. It was about saving countless other lives. In the hospital, João Pedro had a nightmare so violent that he had to be sedated. In his delirium, he murmured, "The snake man." He said Dad knew. Dad knew. Those words hit Roberto like a blade. His research, which was supposed to save lives, was being used to cause suffering. Feeling the weight of guilt, he made a decision that would forever change the course of history. He would use his knowledge not to kill Santos, but to expose the entire criminal organization, even if it put his own life at risk. Roberto began to gather evidence and reorganize all his research on poisons. However, the organization was relentless. In a clear warning, Deputy Oliveira was found unconscious in his car, with an empty syringe next to him. At the hospital, doctors identified traces of the same modified poison that had been used on João Pedro. The violence escalated. Maria Conceição, who continued her silent investigation, had her popcorn stand burned down in the early hours of the morning. Among the wreckage, they found a note. "Burnt popcorn is just the beginning." Even so, Maria was not intimidated. Determined, she began to use more discreet and safer methods to continue gathering evidence. The city of São Paulo, with its contradictions and inequalities, was the scene of an increasingly dark plot. Roberto knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to go to extreme lengths to expose the truth and protect the people he loved. Everyone's fate was now in his hands. João Pedro, still in the hospital, began to display disturbing behavior. His once innocent drawings turned dark, depicting men in police uniforms with faces like scorpions. The medical team noticed that he was developing extreme sensitivity to sounds and movements, as if his body was constantly on alert. Meanwhile, Roberto was faced with a dilemma: protect his son or focus on dismantling the criminal organization. The São Paulo Police Department entered into a real internal war. Inspired by the courage of Chief Oliveira, honest police officers began to speak out against corruption. At the same time, Santos saw his protection network rapidly shrinking. In the Jabaquara neighborhood, the silence in the face of police abuse began to be broken. Fathers and mothers, fearing for their children, formed surveillance groups. Fear was giving way to anger, and that anger was turning into action. Roberto, now aware that he was being monitored by Santos through his laboratory security cameras, decided to use this to his advantage. Instead of hiding his discoveries, he began leaving false clues, mixing true information with misleading data. His objective was to mislead Santos and at the same time draw attention to the real culprits. Meanwhile, Maria Conceição turned the destruction of her tent into a symbol of resistance. With the support of the community, she organized a series of clandestine meetings in different parts of the neighborhood. These meetings became a safe space for victims and witnesses to share information, creating a support and reporting network that was beyond the control of the criminal organization. Camila Santos, the reporter, began publishing in-depth articles on an independent blog. Without revealing her sources, she narrated parts of the investigation, exposing the crimes of the criminal network. His texts went viral, attracting national media attention and increasing public pressure. Julia, Roberto's assistant, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. Torn between being a double informant and her mother's desperation, she began leaving discreet clues to Roberto about Santos's movements. Simultaneously, he fed criminals carefully chosen information to buy time. The Jabaquara neighborhood, once dominated by fear, began to transform into a fortress of solidarity. Groups of parents began accompanying children to school, ensuring their safety. The silent and collective work of the community, combined with the efforts of Roberto, Maria, Camila, and other allies, was building a resistance that threatened to bring down the entire criminal organization. The fight was just beginning, but hope for justice grew with each step taken by those who refused to bow in the face of oppression. Santos, feeling he was losing control, became increasingly erratic and violent. His superiors, fearing exposure of their own involvement, began to distance themselves from him, leaving him isolated and even more dangerous. While Pedro, in a touching moment, asked to return to the park where it all happened, accompanied by his father and Dr. Ana Beatriz, he faced his fears and helped map the location of the attack, identifying patterns that could expose the criminal network. This moment of courage from the boy reinforced Roberto's commitment to dismantling the organization that was behind so many horrors. Roberto, with the support of Maria Conceição, Camila Santos, and Julia, devised a bold plan: use his compound to unequivocally identify everyone who had contact with the modified poisons and thus expose the criminal network once and for all. Despite the risks, everyone agreed it was necessary. Meanwhile, Camila intensified her public awareness campaign through her blog and the media. Without revealing crucial details, his reporting began to attract national attention. Maria Conceição, in turn, transformed her network of informants into an early warning system, with community members monitoring suspicious movements. Julia, still pretending to cooperate with Santos, continued to feed him false information. In a final act of courage, she arranged a meeting with the corrupt police officer, promising to hand over crucial information about Roberto. In reality, it was a carefully planned trap. Delegate Oliveira strategically positioned his trusted team, ready to act at the slightest signal. Roberto had a frank conversation with João Pedro, explaining, as far as possible, the importance of his next steps. The boy, showing impressive maturity, hugged his father and said, "I trust you, Daddy." As the decisive day dawned, the tension was palpable. Roberto arrived at the laboratory early to adjust the last details of his plan. The compound was perfected and ready to be used. At 9 a.m., Julia met Santos at the agreed location, while Camila and her reporting team prepared for a live broadcast that promised to be the biggest story of her career. In the park, Maria Conceição and her network of informants were attentive to every suspicious movement. João Pedro, protected by trusted neighbors, was in a safe location, ready to identify familiar faces among the criminals. When Santos realized the trap, he pulled out his gun and tried to intimidate Roberto. "You have no idea how far this goes, Silva. You and your brat are just the tip of the iceberg." In an instant, chaos ensued. Santos tried to escape but was surrounded by Oliveira's team. Corrupt police officers, realizing they were being exposed, started a shootout. Despite the danger, the group of unlikely heroes stood firm, fighting not only for justice, but for the future of their communities. The morning, which started with tension, turned into a watershed. The criminal network finally faced the justice it had avoided for so long, while the courage of João Pedro and those who supported him lit a new flame of hope. Roberto, protected by Julia, ran to activate the compound dispersal system that he had secretly installed in the park. A blue fog took over the place, affecting dozens of people, many of them children, who began to show signs of exposure to the experimental poisons. Maria Conceição, with her experience on the streets, guided people to safety while chaos unfolded around her. His courage inspired other residents to help, transforming the neighborhood into a community united against crime. João Pedro, from his vantage point, was able to identify several faces that he recognized from his ordeal. Their information, passed on quickly, was crucial in capturing members of the criminal network. With Santos finally captured and the blue fog dissipating, the true extent of the conspiracy began to come to light. Corrupt police officers, politicians, and business people were exposed, their bodies shining as undeniable proof of their involvement. Roberto, exhausted but triumphant, was finally able to hug his son. João Pedro, crying with relief, whispered, "We did it, Dad. We did it." As sirens blared and media swarmed into the park, the group of unlikely heroes shook the city's power structures. Now recognized as a hero by public opinion, Roberto dedicated himself to using his knowledge to help victims of experimental poisons. He worked tirelessly with Dr. Ana Beatriz to develop treatments for those affected, saving lives and providing crucial evidence for legal proceedings. João Pedro, surprising everyone, became a spokesperson for the child victims. Your courage in telling your story has inspired many other families to rise up. Maria Conceição saw her community transform. The Jabaquara neighborhood, once marked by violence, has become a model of community organization and citizen vigilance. His popcorn stand, rebuilt with the help of neighbors, became a symbol of resistance and unity. Julia, after a period under police protection, was reunited with her daughter. Together, they began a new life, free from the fear that tormented them. Julia became an important witness in cases against corruption, and her fight for justice was fundamental in dismantling the system that threatened innocent lives. Roberto's personal vendetta had turned into something much bigger. Not only did he get justice for his son, but he also helped dismantle a corrupt system that harmed many lives. On a quiet afternoon, Roberto took João Pedro back to the park. As they walked among the trees where fear once reigned, now there was the laughter of children playing freely. João Pedro, smiling for the first time in months, said, "Dad, I think I can start liking insects again now." Roberto embraced him with pride, And the park, which once represented fear, became a symbol of social transformation. The Jabaquara neighborhood, now united, inspired other young people to fight for a better future. The story of Roberto and João Pedro showed that, with courage and unity, even the most corrupt system can be overthrown. Even with the new challenges that emerged, the city moved forward, always with the reminder that vigilance was constant, but now there was hope. So, guys, if you've come this far and lived this journey with us, you know how inspiring this story is. She shows how the courage of a few can change the destiny of many. This story teaches us that, even in the face of a corrupt and oppressive system, the courage of a father, the strength of a united community, and the tireless search for justice can make all the difference. Roberto and Juan Pedro not only fought for their lives, but also changed the reality of everyone around them, proving that hope and unity are the keys to transforming any adverse situation. If you were moved by this journey and believe that stories like this need to be shared, be sure to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell to receive notifications, and share with your friends. The fight for justice and social transformation is far from over, and together we can spread even more inspiration to those who need it most. Until next time.